The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Thomas Jenkins' downtown apartment as he stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time. Today wasn't just any ordinary day. Today was the culmination of 6 months of intense work, sleepless nights, and meticulous planning. At 42, Thomas had climbed his way up in the financial world through raw talent, persistence, and an uncanny ability to see opportunities where others saw only risk. "You've got this," he whispered to himself, a habit he'd developed early in his career to calm the butterflies that still fluttered in his stomach before big meetings. Even after 15 years in the industry, the weight of today's meeting sat heavily on his shoulders. As the newly appointed Chief Investment Officer at Global Finance Partners, he was about to lead discussions on a potential $300 million acquisition deal with Stanton Industries, a manufacturing giant looking to expand its operations across 3 continents. If successful, this would be the largest deal of Thomas's career and a defining moment for his new role. Thomas checked his watch. 7:15 a.m. The meeting wasn't until 9:00, but he had always lived by his grandfather's wisdom. Early is on time is late. He grabbed his leather portfolio, stuffed with the presentation he'd rehearsed until the words felt etched into his brain, and headed for the door. The drive to Meridian Tower, Stanton's gleaming headquarters in the heart of the financial district, took less time than expected. Morning traffic had been merciful, and Thomas found himself pulling into the underground parking garage at 8:10 a.m., nearly an hour before the scheduled meeting. Perfect, he thought. Time for one more review and a decent cup of coffee. As he stepped out of his car, Thomas caught his reflection in the window. The charcoal Tom Ford suit had been an extravagance, a gift to himself when he'd landed the CIO position 3 months ago. It fit him perfectly, projecting exactly the image he wanted for today: confident, successful, and unquestionably professional. He straightened his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of representation. In rooms like the one he was about to enter, he was rarely just Thomas Jenkins. He was often the only black executive at the table. The parking garage elevator carried him to the lobby, a vast space of marble and glass that soared upward for 3 stories. Morning light streamed through massive windows, illuminating the space with a golden glow. Several people in business attire hurried across the polished floor, their footsteps echoing slightly in the cavernous space. Thomas approached the reception desk, where a young woman with glasses and a friendly smile greeted him. "Good morning. Welcome to Meridian Tower," she said brightly. "Good morning," Thomas replied, his voice warm but professional. "Thomas Jenkins, Global Finance Partners. I'm here for the 9 a.m. meeting with Stanton Industries." The receptionist tapped at her keyboard. "Yes, Mr. Jenkins. You're the first to arrive from your team." She handed him a visitor's badge. "The meeting will be in the Oakwood Conference Room on the 37th floor. Would you like me to show you to the executive lounge while you wait?" "That would be great, thank you," Thomas said, clipping the badge to his lapel. The executive lounge on the 35th floor offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Thomas chose a quiet corner, set down his portfolio, and pulled out his presentation notes. Although he knew the material inside and out, reviewing it one more time would settle his nerves. A staff member approached, offering coffee. Thomas accepted gratefully, asking for it black. As the rich aroma filled his senses, he pulled out his phone to check for any last-minute emails from his team. There was only one, from his assistant Diane, wishing him luck and confirming that the rest of the global finance team would arrive by 8:45. Thomas smiled at the message. Diane had been with him for 7 years, following him from his previous firm when he'd made the jump to Global Finance Partners. "We're a package deal," she'd told the hiring manager in her no-nonsense way. Her efficiency and loyalty had been invaluable, especially during the transition to his new role. He took a sip of coffee and stared out at the city below. From 35 stories up, the morning rush hour looked like a carefully orchestrated dance of tiny vehicles moving along ribbons of road. Somewhere in those streets, his team was making their way here, ready to back him up in the negotiation ahead. Thomas thought back to how this deal had come together. It had started with a casual conversation at an industry conference 4 months ago, a chance meeting with Elizabeth Chen, Stanton's CEO. They'd found themselves seated at the same table during lunch, and the conversation had quickly moved from pleasantries to business opportunities. Elizabeth had mentioned Stanton's expansion plans, and Thomas had seen the potential immediately. "What you need isn't just capital," he'd told her. "You need a partner who understands the global market you're trying to enter." That 15-minute conversation had led to preliminary meetings, which had led to more detailed discussions, which had culminated in today's meeting, where Thomas would present Global Finance Partners' formal proposal to finance and partner in Stanton's ambitious expansion. The stakes were enormous. Stanton Industries employed over 5,000 people across the country, and this expansion would add another 2,000 jobs. For Global Finance Partners, the deal would establish them as a major player in international investment, elevating their profile and potentially attracting a whole new class of clients. Thomas checked his watch again. 8:30 a.m. Time to head up to the conference room and make sure everything was in place. He gathered his materials, thanked the lounge attendant, and headed to the elevator bank. The 37th floor had a different atmosphere than the lounge below. While the lounge had been designed for comfort and relaxation, this floor meant business. The hallways were wider, the lighting more direct, the artwork more impressive, original paintings rather than prints. Thomas followed the signs to the Oakwood conference room, his footsteps silenced by plush carpeting. The Oakwood conference room lived up to its name, with wall panels of rich, dark wood and a massive table that could easily seat 20. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an even more spectacular view than the lounge. At one end of the room, a large screen was ready for presentations. At the other, a sideboard held water, notepads, and pens emblazoned with the Stanton Industries logo. Thomas was pleased to see a technician already setting up the projection system. "Good morning," Thomas greeted him. "I'll be presenting first today. Mind if I make sure my laptop connects properly to your system?" The technician looked up. "No problem, sir. Let's get you set up." As they worked through the connection, Thomas made small talk, asking about the building and how long the technician had worked there. It was a habit he'd developed years ago, connecting with support staff, who often knew more about the inner workings of a company than the executives did. By 8:40, Thomas had confirmed that his presentation would display correctly, tested the wireless clicker, and arranged his materials at what would be his seat, not at the head of the table but near it, positioned to make eye contact with everyone in the room. He stepped out to the hallway to text Diane that everything was ready, only to see his team emerging from the elevator bank. Alex Wong, his financial analyst, Patricia Rodriguez, legal counsel, and David Chen, market strategist. They looked sharp, prepared, and just as early as he'd expected them to be. "Morning, boss," Alex called out. "Everything set?" "Just about," Thomas replied. "The room's ready, and we've got about 15 minutes to go over any last-minute questions." As they entered the conference room together, Thomas felt a surge of confidence. This was a strong team, and they'd prepared thoroughly. The proposal was solid, the numbers checked and double-checked, the legal framework carefully constructed to protect both parties' interests. They huddled at one end of the conference room, speaking in low voices as Thomas addressed a few final points and reminded everyone of their roles in the presentation. As they talked, other people began to arrive. Stanton Industries executives and their advisors, nodding politely as they entered and selected seats. Thomas recognized several faces from previous meetings: the CFO, the head of operations, the general counsel, but he didn't see Elizabeth Chen yet. As CEO, she would likely arrive last, just before the meeting began. At 8:55, Thomas suggested his team take their seats. They arranged themselves strategically around one side of the table, leaving the other side for the Stanton team. Thomas remained standing, reviewing a note on his phone while actually observing the dynamics of the room. He noticed one man he didn't recognize directing staff, checking the sideboard, and speaking into his phone with an air of authority. The man was in his 50s with graying hair and an expensive but slightly ill-fitting suit. He seemed to be some kind of facilities or administrative manager, making sure everything was in order before the executives arrived in force. At 8:58, the room was nearly full. The energy had shifted from morning casualness to pre-meeting tension. Conversations became more focused, postures more formal. Thomas slipped his phone into his pocket and prepared to greet Elizabeth Chen when she arrived. This was the moment he lived for. The quiet before the storm. When months of work were about to be put to the test, when strategies would be challenged and opportunities seized. In just a few minutes he would stand before this room of powerful people and make the case that would potentially reshape two companies and impact thousands of lives. Thomas took a deep breath. He was ready. What he couldn't know was that the next few minutes would test him in ways that had nothing to do with finance, strategy, or negotiation. A challenge was coming, one that no business school had prepared him for, but one that life as a black executive had taught him to handle with a dignity and resilience that would ultimately prove as valuable as any skill on his impressive resume. The clock struck 9, and still no sign of Elizabeth Chen. Thomas checked his watch again, wondering about the delay. The room had filled with executives from both companies, their chatter creating a steady background hum. His team sat ready, exchanging occasional glances that said, "What's the holdup?" Just then, the door opened. Thomas looked up, expecting to see Elizabeth, but instead, the man he'd noticed earlier, the one who seemed to be handling the meeting logistics, entered and scanned the room with a frown. This was Richard Davenport, though Thomas didn't know his name yet. Richard's eyes settled on Thomas and his frown deepened. Thomas turned back to his notes, unaware that he had become the focus of Richard's attention. He felt a presence beside him moments later and looked up to find Richard standing there, arms folded across his chest. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through noise. "This area is reserved for an important executive meeting today." Thomas blinked, momentarily confused by the statement. He glanced around at the room full of people in business attire, then back at Richard. "Yes, I know," Thomas replied, keeping his voice pleasant and professional. "I'm Thomas Jenkins, Chief Investment Officer at Global Finance Partners. I'm here for the Stanton meeting." Richard's expression didn't change. "Do you have credentials?" "A visitor's badge?" Thomas touched the badge clipped to his lapel, the same badge the receptionist had given him earlier. "Right here." Richard leaned in, studying the badge with exaggerated care, then straightened up. "And who exactly are you meeting with today?" By now, Thomas was growing aware that this wasn't standard security procedure. He'd been in countless corporate meetings over his 15-year career, and badge checks typically happened at building entrances, not after you were already seated in conference rooms. Still, he maintained his composure. "I'm here to present Global Finance Partners' proposal for the $300 million acquisition financing," Thomas explained calmly. "I believe Elizabeth Chen is expecting me." "Ms. Chen hasn't arrived yet," Richard replied, emphasizing the CEO's title. "And I don't recall seeing your name on the attendee list." At this point, Alex Wong, Thomas's financial analyst, leaned forward. "Excuse me, but Mr. Jenkins is leading our presentation today. Our entire team was approved for this meeting weeks ago." Richard barely glanced at Alex. "I'm just doing my job, making sure only authorized personnel are present for this sensitive discussion. Perhaps there's been a miscommunication." Thomas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation he'd experienced too many times before when someone decided he didn't belong in spaces where his accomplishments had earned him a place. He'd developed strategies for these moments over the years, ways to diffuse tension without compromising his dignity. "I understand you're being thorough," Thomas said, his voice remaining steady. "If you check with Elizabeth, Ms. Chen, she'll confirm that I'm supposed to be here." "We've been working on this deal for months." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let me see what documentation you have for this meeting." Thomas opened his portfolio and handed over the meeting invitation email he'd printed, a habit from his early career days that had proven useful in situations just like this. Richard scanned it, frowning again. "This just shows you were invited to a meeting. It doesn't specify your role." By now, the conversation had attracted attention from others in the room. Several executives from Stanton Industries were watching the exchange, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. Thomas was acutely aware of being the only black executive in the room, and of how this interaction might appear to onlookers who didn't intervene. Patricia Rodriguez, Global Finance's legal counsel, stood up. "Our team is here at Stanton Industries' request to present a $300 million financing proposal. Mr. Jenkins is our Chief Investment Officer and the lead on this project. Perhaps you could check with your team to clear up any confusion." Richard seemed unmoved. "I'm responsible for meeting security, and I need to verify everyone's role before we proceed." Thomas noticed that while Richard had questioned him extensively, He hadn't asked for credentials from any other attendees. Even as they spoke, two more executives entered the room, nodded to Richard, and took seats without being stopped or questioned. "Is there someone else we could speak with to resolve this?" Thomas asked, his patience wearing thin but his voice still measured. The meeting was scheduled to start at 9 and we're keeping everyone waiting. Richard hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "I'll check with Ms. Chen's assistant." As Richard stepped away to make his call, David Chen, the market strategist from Thomas's team, leaned over. "This is ridiculous," he whispered. "Should we call Elizabeth directly?" Thomas shook his head slightly. "Let's give their process a chance to work. We don't want to start this relationship by going over someone's head." But inside, Thomas was performing the complex calculations familiar to many professionals of color, weighing when to push back, when to educate, when to let things slide, and when to stand firm. He'd built his career navigating these invisible currents, always aware that his reactions were being judged differently than his white colleagues. Across the room, Richard was having an intense conversation on his phone, gesturing occasionally toward Thomas. The other executives had broken into small groups, some openly watching the drama unfold, others pretending not to notice while stealing glances. Thomas used the moment to center himself. He thought of his mentor, an older black executive who had taken him under his wing 20 years ago. "When they try to make you forget your worth," his mentor had told him, "that's when you need to remember it most clearly." Thomas straightened his papers, adjusted his tie, and prepared to handle whatever came next. Richard returned, looking slightly less certain but no less determined. "Ms. Chen's assistant says there was indeed a global finance team scheduled, but she's checking on the specific attendees. Perhaps while we wait for that confirmation, I could set up my presentation?" Thomas suggested. "I wouldn't want to delay the meeting any further." Richard shook his head. "I can't allow that until we've cleared this up. Protocol requires." He was interrupted by the arrival of 3 more Stanton executives who greeted several people in the room by name before taking their seats. Again, Richard made no move to check their credentials. The contrast was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone in the room. A few uncomfortable glances were exchanged among the Stanton team. One older executive looked at Thomas apologetically but said nothing. Thomas decided to try a different approach. "Richard, may I call you Richard? I understand you're doing your job. Security is important, especially for a meeting of this significance. But I assure you my team and I are exactly where we're supposed to be." Before Richard could respond, his phone rang. He answered immediately, listened for a moment, and his expression shifted to something between surprise and alarm. "Yes, Ms. Chen, right away, Ms. Chen," he said, his tone suddenly deferential. He ended the call and looked at Thomas with new eyes, not apologetic but reassessing. "Ms. Chen is on her way up," he announced to the room at large. "She'll be here momentarily." The atmosphere in the room shifted. People who had been standing moved to take their seats. Conversations quieted. Thomas returned to his position, outwardly calm but inwardly preparing for what might come next. 2 minutes later, the door opened, and Elizabeth Chen strode in. At 53, she was a commanding presence, confident, sharp-eyed, dressed impeccably in a navy suit. Her gaze swept the room and landed on Thomas. "Thomas," she called out, her voice warm with recognition. "So glad you could make it. We've been looking forward to your presentation on the acquisition proposal." She crossed the room, hand extended. Thomas stood and shook it, professional as always. "Elizabeth, good to see you again," he replied smoothly, as if the previous 15 minutes hadn't happened. Elizabeth turned to address the room. "For those who haven't had the pleasure of meeting him, this is Thomas Jenkins, Chief Investment Officer at Global Finance Partners. He's the key decision-maker representing the firm, providing the $300 million in financing that we've been discussing for our expansion." She gestured to Thomas's team. "And these are his colleagues who have been working closely with our finance department to structure the deal." Thomas could see Richard from the corner of his eye. Standing near the wall, his face drained of color as the realization hit him. The man he had been blocking, questioning, and doubting was not some random interloper, but the executive controlling the $300 million deal that Stanton Industries desperately needed. As Elizabeth continued her introductions, Richard slipped quietly toward the back of the room, trying to become invisible. But the damage was done. Everyone had witnessed his treatment of Thomas, and now they understood exactly what had happened. Thomas pushed aside his feelings about the incident. The deal was what mattered now. The jobs it would create, the opportunities it would build, the relationship between two companies that could grow into something beneficial for everyone involved. He had long ago learned to separate personal slights from professional goals, to keep his eyes on the bigger picture, even when others couldn't see past their own biases. As Elizabeth invited him to begin his presentation, Thomas stepped forward, ready to show everyone in the room exactly why he was there and exactly what he brought to the table. The confrontation had shaken him, but it hadn't broken his focus. If anything, it had strengthened his resolve to make this presentation the best of his career. "Thank you, Elizabeth," he said, his voice clear and confident as he clicked to his first slide. "Today, I'm going to show you how global finance partners can help turn Stanton's expansion vision into reality." Thomas took a deep breath and clicked to his first slide. A sleek professional graphic appeared on the screen showing both company logos side by side with the words, "Strategic Partnership," beneath them. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. "Thank you for the introduction, Elizabeth," Thomas began, his voice steady and confident despite the awkward start to the meeting. "At Global Finance Partners, we believe that the best business relationships aren't just about money. They're about shared vision and mutual growth." He clicked to the next slide, which displayed a world map highlighting Stanton, Industries' current locations, and the proposed expansion areas in blue and gold. Stanton Industries has built an impressive manufacturing network across North America. What we're proposing today is not just funding for expansion, but a true partnership to help you establish a similar level of excellence across 3 new continents. As Thomas spoke, he gradually reclaimed the room. His deep knowledge of the industry, confident delivery, and thoughtful insights drew in the executives who had witnessed his humiliation just minutes ago. Even those who had looked away during Richard's confrontation were now leaning forward, engaged by Thomas's presentation. Richard had retreated to a corner seat, his face a mask of discomfort. He kept his eyes fixed on his notepad, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Occasionally, he would glance up at Thomas with a mixture of embarrassment and surprise, clearly reassessing the man he had tried to remove from the meeting. Elizabeth Chen sat at the head of the table, nodding approvingly as Thomas walked through the financial projections. Her occasional questions were insightful and forward-thinking, and the easy rapport between her and Thomas made it obvious they had developed a professional relationship over months of preliminary discussions. "One of the challenges of global expansion," Thomas continued, moving to a slide about risk management, "is navigating different regulatory environments. Our team has extensive experience in all 3 regions you're targeting." He gestured to Patricia, his legal counsel. Patricia has personally handled regulatory compliance for manufacturing facilities in 12 countries across Asia and Europe. Patricia added a few comments about her experience, further cementing the impression that Global Finance Partners brought not just money, but valuable expertise to the table. Thomas moved efficiently through the presentation, neither rushing nor dwelling too long on any point. He had a natural teacher's gift for making complex financial concepts accessible without talking down to his audience. When he discussed the proposed financing structure, he used clear analogies that resonated with both the financial and operational executives in the room. "Think of this as building a house," he explained, showing a slide with different financing components. "The foundation is the initial capital investment. The framework is the structured credit facility, and the roof is the revolving line that protects the entire project from unexpected downpours." Thomas noticed that even Richard had begun to look up more frequently, seemingly drawn in by the presentation despite himself. When Thomas reached the section on job creation and economic impact, Richard actually took notes, his pen moving quickly across the page. "We estimate that this expansion will create approximately 2,000 new jobs across the 3 regions, Thomas said, his passion for the human impact of the deal evident in his voice. "That's not just 2,000 paychecks, that's 2,000 families with improved financial security, 2,000 opportunities for career growth, and significant economic benefits for the communities where these facilities will be located." Elizabeth nodded in agreement. The community impact has always been a core value for Stanton. "I'm glad to see that Global Finance shares that perspective." "Absolutely," Thomas replied. "In fact, We've included provisions for local workforce development programs in each region, which you'll see on the next slide. As Thomas continued, he made a point of engaging with everyone around the table, making eye contact with each person as he addressed different aspects of the deal. When he reached the section on manufacturing technology upgrades, he directed his comments to the Chief Operating Officer. When discussing financial projections, he engaged with Stanton's CFO. He even glanced occasionally at Richard when discussing the timeline and logistics of the expansion, including him in the conversation despite their earlier interaction. This inclusive approach wasn't just good presentation technique. It reflected Thomas's genuine belief that successful business required bringing everyone along, even those who might initially resist or doubt. After 40 minutes of presentation, Thomas opened the floor for questions. Hands went up immediately. "What protections do we have if market conditions change in these new regions?" asked Stanton's CFO. Thomas nodded, acknowledging the excellent question. "We've built several safeguards into the agreement," he explained, clicking to a slide he had ready for this very question. "First, the phased funding approach means you're not committed to the entire expansion at once. Second, we've included market volatility buffers in the financing terms. And third, our team will provide quarterly market analysis for each region, allowing for strategic adjustments if conditions shift." The CFO looked impressed. More questions followed about interest rates, about governance structure, about integration with existing operations. Thomas answered each one thoroughly, occasionally deferring to members of his team for specialized details, but always bringing the conversation back to the big picture. Throughout the Q&A, Elizabeth watched Thomas with evident approval. She had championed this partnership within Stanton, and Thomas's performance was validating her judgment. After nearly 30 minutes of questions, Elizabeth checked her watch and stood up. "I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Thomas, thank you for an excellent presentation. I'd like to suggest we take a 15-minute break and then reconvene for a discussion of next steps." As people began to stand and stretch, Elizabeth approached Thomas. "That was precisely the presentation we needed," she said, keeping her voice low. "You've addressed every concern our board raised last week." Thomas smiled. "I'm glad to hear that. Your team asked great questions. Shows they're really engaging with the proposal." Elizabeth glanced briefly toward Richard, who was quickly gathering his papers. "About earlier," Thomas shook his head slightly. "Let's focus on the deal. That's what matters today." Elizabeth gave him a look of respect tinged with apology. "You're right. But we will address it later." As people filtered out of the room for the break, Thomas turned to his team. "Nice job, everyone. Patricia, excellent points on the regulatory framework. Alex, good catch on the CFO's question about currency hedging." "You killed it, boss," Alex replied with a grin. "Did you see their faces when you laid out the community impact numbers?" They weren't expecting that level of detail. David nodded in agreement. "The regional market analysis sealed it, I think. Shows we've done our homework." Thomas began organizing his notes for the next portion of the meeting when he noticed someone approaching from his peripheral vision. It was Richard, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Jenkins," Richard began, his voice noticeably more deferential than earlier. "I wonder if I might have a word?" Thomas looked up, keeping his expression neutral. "Of course." Richard glanced around, clearly preferring to have this conversation without an audience. Thomas's team took the hint and stepped away, moving toward the refreshment table that had been set up in the corner. "I want to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier," Richard said, the words coming out stiffly. "It was not my intention to cause any awkwardness." Thomas studied the man for a moment. There was discomfort in Richard's posture, but whether it was genuine regret or simply embarrassment at having misjudged someone important to the deal, Thomas couldn't tell. "Misunderstandings happen," Thomas replied evenly. "Let's move forward and focus on making this partnership successful." Richard seemed surprised by this response, perhaps having expected anger or a desire for further apology. "Yes, well, your presentation was very impressive. I can see why Ms. Chen speaks so highly of you." Thomas nodded, acknowledging the compliment without particularly welcoming it. "If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for the next session." As Richard walked away, Thomas watched him go, thinking about all the misunderstandings he had encountered throughout his career. Some had been genuine confusion, others thinly veiled prejudice,
He had learned to navigate.
I gate them all with the same professional poise, never letting them derail his purpose or diminish his excellence. The room began to fill again as executives returned from the break. Elizabeth took her place at the head of the table, gesturing for Thomas to join her. As he moved to the front of the room, Thomas felt a familiar sense of purpose. Whatever obstacles arose, whether financial challenges, market uncertainties, or human biases, he would face them head-on, with the same determination that had brought him to this moment. "Shall we continue?" Elizabeth asked the room, her voice carrying a note of excitement about the partnership taking shape before them. Thomas nodded, ready for what came next. "Absolutely. The best is yet to come." After the break, the meeting shifted from presentation to discussion. The large conference table that had separated the two companies now became the center of collaboration, as executives from both sides began to work through the finer details of the partnership. "I suggest we break into smaller groups," Elizabeth proposed. "Finance team with finance, operations with operations, and so on. That way we can dig into the specifics relevant to each department." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Good idea. My team is prepared to answer detailed questions in their respective areas of expertise." As people rearranged themselves around the room, Thomas noticed Richard hovering uncertainly near the door. Elizabeth noticed too and called out to him. "Richard, could you make sure we have the conference rooms on this floor available for the breakout sessions, and perhaps arrange for some lunch to be brought in around noon? This might run longer than we anticipated." Richard nodded quickly. "Right away, Ms. Chen." He seemed almost grateful for the direction, for having a clear role again after his earlier mistake had thrown him off balance. Thomas found himself paired with Stanton's CFO, a sharp-minded woman named Lisa Taylor, and their respective financial teams. They claimed a corner of the main conference room, spreading financial projections across the table. "These growth projections in Southeast Asia look ambitious," Lisa remarked, tapping a figure on one of the spreadsheets. "What data are you basing these on?" Thomas pulled out his tablet and opened a research report. "We commissioned an independent market analysis from Baker Consulting. They've done extensive work in the region and their growth models have proven reliable in similar expansions." Lisa looked impressed. "You've really done your homework." "We don't take $300 million commitments lightly," Thomas replied with a small smile. Across the room, Patricia was deep in discussion with Stanton's legal team, while Alex and David worked with operations and marketing respectively. The energy in the room had transformed completely from the tension of the early morning to a buzz of productive collaboration. Occasionally, Thomas would glance up and catch Richard watching him from the doorway as he coordinated with catering staff or directed facilities personnel. Their eyes would meet briefly before Richard would look away, his discomfort still evident. By noon, significant progress had been made. When lunch arrived, an impressive spread of sandwiches, salads, and refreshments, Elizabeth suggested they take a working break rather than a formal pause. "Let's keep the momentum going," she said. "We've got good energy in the room." People filled plates and continued their discussions. Thomas found himself in a circle with Elizabeth, Lisa, and Stanton's head of global operations, Michael Winters. "The phased approach you've suggested for the expansion makes a lot of sense," Michael was saying as he picked up a sandwich. "Starting with Malaysia gives us a foothold in the region before tackling the more complex markets." "That was Thomas's recommendation," Elizabeth noted. "Initially, I wanted to launch all 3 locations simultaneously." Michael raised his eyebrows. "That would have been a logistical nightmare," Thomas finished with a chuckle. "Not impossible, but unnecessarily challenging. Better to establish one successful operation and learn from it before replicating." Elizabeth nodded. "And that's why we need partners who will tell us when our ambitions are outpacing practicality." Thomas hasn't been afraid to push back when needed. The conversation continued, touching on supply chain considerations, local labor markets, and regional competitors. Thomas found himself impressed with the Stanton team's knowledge and preparation. They had clearly done their research and came ready with thoughtful questions. After lunch, the larger group reconvened to share key findings and decisions from their breakout discussions. Thomas sat beside Elizabeth at the head of the table, a position that symbolically reinforced their company's partnership. "Before we continue," Elizabeth said, addressing the room, I want to acknowledge the exceptional preparation that Global Finance Partners has brought to this meeting. Many of you have mentioned to me how impressed you are with the level of detail and thoughtfulness in their proposal. There were nods around the table. Even those who had witnessed the morning's uncomfortable confrontation were now looking at Thomas and his team with genuine respect. As Thomas emphasized in his presentation, Elizabeth continued, "This isn't just about financing, it's about partnership. I believe we found the right partner for this next chapter in Stanton's growth." She turned to Thomas. "Would you like to share some of the key takeaways from today's discussions?" Thomas stood, scanning the room briefly. His gaze passed over Richard, who had returned and was standing against the wall, before addressing the group. "First, I want to thank everyone for their engagement today. What's become clear is that both our organizations share not just complementary business goals, but also similar values. We've heard consistent emphasis on sustainable growth, community impact, and ethical business practices from both sides of the table." He picked up a document from in front of him. "Based on today's discussions, we've identified 3 immediate action items: finalizing the phased implementation schedule, completing the regulatory pre-assessments for each region, and establishing the joint governance committee that will oversee the expansion." Thomas continued outlining the next steps, assigning responsibilities to teams from both companies. As he spoke, he could see people taking notes, nodding in agreement with the plan taking shape. "If we maintain this level of collaboration," he concluded, "I believe we can have the first phase of financing ready to deploy within 60 days, allowing the Malaysia facility to break ground before the end of the quarter." Elizabeth looked pleased. "That's an aggressive timeline, but achievable with the right team. And I believe we have that team in this room today." The meeting continued for another hour, with various executives presenting specialized portions of the implementation plan. Thomas watched with satisfaction as his team members fielded questions with confidence and expertise. They had prepared meticulously for this day, and it showed. As the formal part of the meeting drew to a close, Elizabeth stood for final remarks. "I want to thank everyone for their contributions today. We've accomplished more than I expected, and I'm excited about the path forward." She turned to Thomas. "And special thanks to Thomas and the Global Finance team for their exceptional work in preparing this partnership." There was a round of applause, and Thomas nodded in acknowledgement, his expression modest but pleased. "We'll circulate meeting notes and action items by the end of day," Elizabeth continued. "For those of you from Global Finance, we'd be honored if you could join us for dinner this evening to celebrate this new partnership." As people began gathering their materials and engaging in post-meeting conversations, Thomas felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Richard standing there looking uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Jenkins, I was wondering if I might have a word with you, in private if possible." Thomas considered the request for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." Richard led him to a small meeting room across the hall. Once inside, he closed the door and took a deep breath before speaking. "I wanted to apologize properly for this morning," he began. "My behavior was inappropriate, and I recognize that now." Thomas remained silent, giving Richard space to continue. "I've worked for Stanton for 12 years, Richard went on. "I take my responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously sometimes, but that's not an excuse for how I treated you." Thomas studied the man's face, looking for sincerity behind the words. "May I ask you something, Richard?" Richard looked surprised but nodded. "Of course. Did you question the credentials of anyone else who entered that room this morning?" "Anyone at all?" The question hung in the air. Richard's expression shifted as the implication sank in. He looked down at his shoes, then back up at Thomas. "No," he admitted quietly. "I didn't." Thomas nodded, appreciating the honesty, if belated. "I didn't think so." Richard swallowed hard. "I'd like to say it wasn't about— I didn't intend to single out the only black executive in the room," Thomas finished for him. His tone wasn't angry, just matter of fact. Richard flushed. "When you put it that way—" "That is the way," Thomas said simply, whether it was conscious or not. A long moment passed between them, tense but somehow necessary. "I'm truly sorry," Richard finally said, and this time, the words seemed to come from somewhere deeper. Thomas considered his response carefully. He had been in similar situations before, had received similar apologies. Some were genuine moments of recognition and growth. Others were merely attempts to ease guilty consciences. He wasn't sure yet which category this one fell into, but he believed in giving people the chance to learn and change. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "What matters now is what happens tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that." Richard nodded slowly, seeming to understand that this wasn't about a single apology, but about ongoing awareness and action. "The deal we're working on will create opportunities for thousands of people," Thomas continued. "That's what I'm focused on. That's what matters most." As they prepared to rejoin the others, Richard paused with his hand on the door handle. "Mr. Jenkins, Thomas, I hope we'll have the chance to work together again. I think I could learn a lot from you." Thomas gave him a small but genuine smile. "I look forward to that possibility, Richard. Now shall we get back? I believe we have a partnership to build." 3 months had passed since that pivotal meeting at Stanton Industries. It was a crisp autumn morning as Thomas pulled into the parking lot of the newly constructed Global Finance Partners headquarters. The modern glass building caught the morning sunlight, creating a warm glow that matched Thomas's mood. As chief investment officer, Thomas had been instrumental in the company's recent growth, with the Stanton deal serving as a crown jewel in their portfolio. The $300 million partnership had moved forward even faster than anticipated. With ground already broken on the Malaysia facility and plans for the other 2 locations well underway, Thomas grabbed his coffee from the cup holder and stepped out of his car. As he walked toward the building, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. Global Finance Partners had nearly doubled its staff, expanded into 2 new markets, and gained a reputation as the go-to firm for complex international investments. Inside the lobby, he greeted the security team by name, a habit he maintained no matter how busy he became. Thomas believed that relationships at all levels mattered, perhaps because he understood better than most how often people in support roles went unnoticed or underappreciated. "Morning. Mr. Jenkins," called Diane, his assistant, as he stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor. "Your 9:30 is already here." Thomas checked his watch, 8:45. "They're early." "Apparently eager," Diane replied with a small smile. "I've put them in the Aspen conference room with coffee. Thanks. Any word from Elizabeth about tomorrow's site visit?" "She confirmed last night. Her flight lands at 3 p.m., and she's heading straight to the construction site to meet you." Thomas nodded, pleased. Elizabeth Chen had become not just a business partner, but a valued colleague over the past months. They shared a vision for how the Stanton Global Finance Partnership could set new standards in the industry. "Oh, and this came for you," Diane added, handing him a thick envelope with the Stanton Industries logo. "Courier delivered it this morning. Marked personal and confidential." Thomas tucked the envelope under his arm. "I'll look at it before my 9:30. Hold my calls unless it's an emergency, please." In his office, Thomas set down his coffee and opened the envelope. Inside was a formal letter on Stanton letterhead and a bound document. The letter, signed by Elizabeth, was brief but significant. "Dear Thomas," it read, "as promised, I wanted to share this with you before it's implemented company-wide next week. Your insights during our conversation 3 months ago sparked significant changes at Stanton, and I believe we're better for it. Looking forward to seeing the progress at the site tomorrow. Warmest regards, Elizabeth." Thomas set aside the letter and turned to the bound document. The cover read, "Stanton Industries Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative, Comprehensive Training and Policy Overhaul." Curious, he flipped through the pages, finding detailed protocols for hiring practices, promotion criteria, and mandatory training programs designed to address unconscious bias throughout the organization. The document was impressive in its scope and specificity. This wasn't window dressing, but a genuine attempt at institutional change. As Thomas read further, he came across a section titled Case Studies in Unconscious Bias. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized a carefully anonymized version of his own experience at Stanton. The case study didn't name names, but described how a visiting executive had been inappropriately challenged and nearly removed from a meeting due to assumptions made about their belonging. Thomas leaned back in his chair, memories of that day washing over him. He hadn't mentioned the incident again after his private conversation with Richard, choosing instead to focus on building the partnership. But clearly, Elizabeth had taken notice and decided the moment should serve as a learning opportunity. His intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Sorry to disturb you," Diane's voice came through, "but your 9:30 is getting a bit anxious. Should I ask them to wait a bit longer?" "No, that's fine," Thomas replied. "I'll be right there." He closed the document, making a mental note to finish reviewing it later, and headed to the Aspen conference room. When he opened the door, he stopped short, momentarily surprised. Sitting at the table, looking nervous but determined, was Richard Davenport. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Richard said, standing quickly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Thomas composed himself and stepped forward, extending his hand. "Richard, this is unexpected. When my assistant mentioned a meeting with Stanton Industries, I assumed it would be someone from the project team." Richard shook his hand firmly. "I requested this meeting personally. I'm no longer with Stanton, actually. That's partly why I'm here." Intrigued, Thomas took a seat across from him. "I see. What can I do for you, then?" Richard took a deep breath. "After our encounter 3 months ago, I did a lot of thinking. Elizabeth, Ms. Chen, also had several direct conversations with me about what happened." Thomas nodded but remained silent, giving Richard space to continue. "The company implemented a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program," Richard went on. "I was asked to participate, of course, but more than that, I was encouraged to examine my own behavior and assumptions. I received a preview of the program materials this morning," Thomas said, gesturing toward his office. "It looks thorough." "It is," Richard agreed, "and necessary. But for me, it became more than just a corporate training exercise. It became personal." Richard pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table between them. "I've spent the last 3 months doing research, having conversations and reflecting on my own career. I realized that what happened with you wasn't an isolated incident, neither in the business world nor in my own behavior." Thomas leaned forward slightly. His interest genuinely piqued now. "I've left Stanton to start a consulting firm focused on workplace inclusion," Richard continued, opening the folder to reveal a business plan. "I want to help companies identify and address the kind of subtle biases that I myself was guilty of perpetuating." Thomas raised an eyebrow, surprised by this unexpected turn. "That's quite a career change." "It is," Richard acknowledged, "but it feels right. I've spent 20 years in corporate environments where these issues were ignored or treated as afterthoughts. I want to use that experience, including my own mistakes, to drive real change." He pushed the folder toward Thomas. "I'm here because I'd like your input, not as an investor or potential client, but as someone whose perspective I've come to value. You handled our first meeting with a grace and professionalism I didn't deserve. I'd like to learn from that example." Thomas studied Richard's face, looking for signs of insincerity but finding none. The man sitting across from him seemed genuinely transformed from the defensive, status-conscious manager he'd encountered 3 months earlier. "This is unexpected, Richard," Thomas said finally, "but I appreciate your candor." He picked up the folder and glanced through its contents. A well-researched business plan, focused on helping companies move beyond superficial diversity initiatives toward meaningful cultural change. "You've put considerable thought into this," Thomas observed. Richard nodded. "I've been working on it nights and weekends for months. I believe in it." Thomas closed the folder and handed it back. "Tell me something, Richard. What would you say was your most important takeaway from what happened between us?" Richard considered the question carefully before responding. "That awareness isn't enough," he said finally. "I always thought of myself as a fair-minded person. I have friends from different backgrounds. I vote for progressive candidates. I thought that meant I couldn't possibly have biases." He shook his head, dismayed by his past assumptions. "But when the moment came, I acted on unconscious patterns I didn't even know I had. And the real lesson came afterward, when I realized it wasn't enough just to feel bad about it. I needed to change how I operate in the world, not just how I think about myself." Thomas nodded slowly, impressed by the depth of Richard's reflection. "That's a value. Able insight. So," Richard said, looking hopeful but prepared for rejection, "would you be willing to look over my plans, offer some feedback, maybe meet again in a few weeks after you've had time to review everything more thoroughly?" Thomas considered the request. He was a busy man with enormous responsibilities, and this was not how he'd planned to spend his limited time. But something about Richard's sincerity and the potential impact of his proposed work resonated with Thomas. "I'll review your materials," he agreed. And yes, we can meet again, but I'd like to suggest something else as well. Anything, Richard said eagerly. Global Finance is hosting a leadership summit next month. We're bringing together executives from various industries to discuss future trends, including workplace culture. I think your perspective as someone who's recognized and addressed their own biases could be valuable. Would you be interested in participating in a panel discussion? Richard looked stunned. You'd want me to. I mean, after how I treated you? This isn't about you and me anymore, Thomas explained. It's about creating meaningful change in how companies operate. Your story, our story, could help others recognize blind spots in their organizations. A slow smile spread across Richard's face. I'd be honored, truly. As they wrapped up the meeting, scheduling a follow-up conversation and exchanging contact information, Thomas felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond business success. The $300 million deal with Stanton Industries had created jobs, expanded markets, and generated significant profits for both companies. All important achievements. But this unexpected outcome, a person confronting their biases and committing to positive change, held a different kind of value. Later that afternoon, as Thomas prepared for his site visit with Elizabeth the next day, he reread the diversity initiative document she had sent. The final page contained a simple but powerful statement of commitment. At Stanton Industries, we believe that acknowledging our mistakes is the first step toward creating a truly inclusive workplace. We are committed not just to preventing future incidents of bias, but to building a culture where every person is valued, heard, and respected for their contributions. Thomas smiled to himself. Sometimes the most important deals weren't measured in dollars, but in human growth and organizational change. The $300 million partnership with Stanton had been transformative in ways that went far beyond the balance sheet, and in the end, that might be its most valuable return.